All right, cool. We're live. So, hey everybody, I'm the Austrian, and do you just want to shout out your name or?
Yeah, I go by the Pakistani Reactionary online.
Nice, nice. So, we're talking about if culture is property, and I've read your posts about it, and I see the case to be made, but why don't you just make it here for everybody, and then we can kind of go off of that.
Yeah, well, basically, I don't really claim it necessarily to be property per se. Kurt Doolittle uses the term property as a subset of property in toto. Personally, like a lot of people use the term property, capitalists use it, Marxists use it, and I feel like it doesn't really have a very universal meaning in any sense. So I prefer to refer to it as investments in tangible and intangible assets. And the process of property is we go to protect these investments in tangible and intangible assets so that we can protect the investment, so that we allow people to benefit off of those investments, and so that we incentivize further investment in whatever assets there are. And so we see this with farmland, for farmland, someone like lays claim to a piece of land, they grow wheat or whatever. And I mean, like, you want people to do that because you want to reap the benefits of those things. So you protect property, that kind of property, and then so that you incentivize more. So you protect the investments they've made. So you can all benefit from the division of labor. And Kurt Doolittle, he's a proprietarian, and so I mean he extends the property term from physical and self property into all sorts of other aspects where humans invest in intangible assets with which for which they hope to profit off of. And so that's
Interesting.
basically like the 2 minute thing.
Okay, so I see what you're saying. I have when you put it like that, I have a little more problems with it than I initially had because so first off, I don't think there's really anything that's necessarily an intangible asset. I mean, there are different processes of goods. Like obviously, land is a good, but the land itself is what you're working. That is a tangible thing. There's the capital goods that you use to make the final product. If, like, say, you're investing in some sort of manufacturing, but there's in like even money is depending on how what you consider money to be. Money is still something tangible, or it's supposed to represent
Mm-hmm.
necessarily something tangible in most cases, like especially when we had the gold standard. But
Yeah.
there's not necessarily a point in which someone's using not physically have something to show for it. And then on top of that, I when someone makes investment into something, it's not necessarily that others benefit off of it, more so that you personally benefit off of it, and the only way you do benefit off it is by having it benefit other people. But the benefiting other people is almost kind of it's a secondary thought because the first thought of is how can I help myself, and that's through investing in these kinds of goods. And then I guess my third criticism would be, and then I'll let you go for a bit again, would be that if we're defining property as in something you have to put the investment into, it's a conscious investment. It's not like something unconsciously done, which is kind of culture. Culture isn't necessarily something people or each individual puts thought into as they're contributing to
Mm-hmm.
it. It's sort of a spontaneous reaction to the circumstances around us. And so if you're not putting conscious effort into something, I don't know if you could have the same claim to it as something that's, physical, like other forms of property.
Mm-hmm. Are you done?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are intangible assets. I mean, the main type of intangible asset is intellectual property, and I mean, there's really no physical claim for it. All it is you're allowed a monopoly, and those are assets, and they have a monetary value, and you can trade them and you can exchange them, and all it is a promise that you will have a monopoly on the production of so and so drug or whatever. So I mean, there are intangible assets, and so when we look at with property, when we look at something like, and when I'm talking about property, it's like property is it's different from possession. It's a higher order than just possession. So possession, this is a main thing I have a problem with the Rothbardians on, is that possession, it is something which you take measures to prevent others from consuming or using. but property is necessarily a social, I'm not going to say social construct, but it's relying upon others. So if it's relying upon being in a social setting. So it's about recognition, and there are bounds to that property. So you only really have property when you're in some sort of society or polity, or when you're within a group, and so that you can set bounds for, this is mine, I can do what I want with it under XYZ stipulations. So I deconflate between possessions and property. So, and then so when I'm saying that, and so property is based, it's also based on mutual insurance. It's mutual insurance. Property rights are what you have when you have a third party insurer, usually a government, but it doesn't have to be a government. It could be a militia of peers or whatever. I mean, they could insure your access to that property. And so, I mean, so they're different tiers. And what was I saying? So yeah, there's different tiers from possession, property rights. And so when I'm saying, so you need to give people a reason to insure your property. If I set up a brothel next to your house, and your kids go and they spend all their allowance at my whorehouse, you're not going to be too keen on protecting my brothel. So I mean, like, it's about benefiting yourself. That's why the individual goes into it. But to make it property, and to make it a property right, you need to benefit others, or else they're not going to have any incentive to protect it. And then what was your third one? Was about the conscious investment?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, norms are, culture is a couple different things. It's like norms, traditions, language, shared beliefs, whatever. And I mean, they are pretty conscious. It's in your subconscious, but they are investments. So when you have, so for example, haggling is the one that I use as far as markets. And so in the U.S., it is not a normal, in a normal market, like a grocery store, you can't go up to a cashier and be like, I'll give you $2 for this fruit or whatever, instead of $3. There is price transparency. There are set prices. And what the lack of haggling allows you to do is allows you to have price transparency, and it discourages rent seeking. Versus if you go into like South Asia, for example, you have like, that's where I'm from originally. It's like when you go into a market, it's you go to a fruit vendor, every single opportunity they have, they look at it as an attempt to just not extort, but they just use to get as much money out of you as possible. So the last time I was in Pakistan was about probably like 2012. My mom, she went up to buy watermelons, and like, they can tell that you're not from the area. They can tell you're like a foreign Pakistani. You're like, you live in America. So they just charge the shit out of you. And then when there's someone who's like a native that they know they can't do that to, so they give them like the regular price. But I mean, so it's an opportunity for rent seeking behaviors. And when you have set prices, when you have price transparency, you have higher value markets. And so I mean, these do have a tangible effect, and they are conscious investments. So they're conscious investments in that you penalize people who break those norms. You exclude them from your markets. You exclude them from your social circles. And I mean, it's, although you don't think of it as like, oh, I'm protecting my norms, the fact that you consciously retaliate against people who break your norms, and retaliation is not violent. It's disassociation, sanction, whatever. The fact that you retaliate against people who break your norms and you exclude them from your social circles, you are preserving your norms, even though you're not consciously thinking of, oh, I'm defending the normative commons by retaliating against Joe for sagging his pants in my grocery store. So that's what I mean when I talk about that.
Okay. So I'll try to think back through everything you said real quick and just kind of respond to one at a time again. I guess my first point would be that I don't actually, and I think this is the Austrian view in general, but we don't believe in intellectual property as a valid form of property. And so we kind of, there's a way where we kind of allow it, like, you can say, you do not have, if you purchase this thing, you are agreeing not to copy my work. And if you do so, you are invalidating your purchase and your claims to my work, which you have copied and then made a profit off of. So there's like some way to work copyright in there in like a free trade society kind of thing, but intellectual property is like the way we have it set up now, where you get a patent on it, isn't valid. But I won't harp on that too much. Your second point was that what was your second point again?
It was off of what you were saying. I forget your order of points.
It was something to do with. All right, then you know what? I'll just respond to your last point first, and hopefully it'll come back to me. But so, as to being a conscious investment, well, the thing about if you're breaking just individual norms and you have individual disassociation, eventually you have just if a large opinion is swayed, if a bunch of people's opinions is swayed, then the culture suddenly changes, and then your norms become irrelevant. So your investment becomes irrelevant. So if you're proposing that kind of society and culture are this massive kind of collectivized property where everyone's actions in some form or another contributing to it, you're kind of lending it to some massive tragedy of the commons, where if you convince a bunch of simpletons in some community that some otherwise destructive behavior is suddenly good for them, then what you considered your norms and the most beneficial norms to you in the first place didn't even matter. And then you can't protect it because everybody suddenly disagrees with you. It's kind of like what happens in, a commune. It's kind of like the incentive problem. If you're getting paid the same as everybody else, then you're not going to work as hard as putting into it. So if everybody else's reaction to breaking the norms is to not react, essentially, then you're not going to worry about maintaining the norms either. And your incentive into inputting into that culture is kind of goes the same way there. And so if culture is some kind of property, it's lending itself to mass collectivization. And I would say and that's something else I kind of wanted to talk about. Property in one way or another, it can be owned by an individual. It can, in some way or another, even though it's, you can have stocks in a company, but you have then a set ownership, a portion of ownership in that company. So there's still an individual claim to some of that. You can't have really an individual claim to any part of the culture that you're trying to defend. Either, you're with the culture that's dominant in your geographical region, or you're against it. And so that's because you can't stake an individual claim in it. It's really hard to kind of say I'm trying to defend something, like, especially, if society devolves into some kind of Marxist hellhole and you're the only one trying to defend individual rights, well, then it doesn't matter because they're just going to hang you by the rope you sold them, yada, yada, yada. And I'm trying to remember I'm trying to remember my second point again, because it was more relating to that.
We speak in a very same, we have similar biases. So, like Hoppe followers and those who are just kind of reactionaries who are students of propertarianism, we have similar values. But I mean, the main thing is that we just go about things different ways. So, I mean, Hoppe realizes that culture is an important thing, which is worth protecting. That's why he goes through this, he jumps hoops and saying, well, we could have anarchy, but then I'll have my community and then I'll make you sign like a 500-page contract which stipulates all the rules and regulations of you living here, and then it's still compatible. So what you see Hoppe doing is he's trying to mold everything so that's still compatible with Murray Rothbard's work, so it's still compatible with decades of what he's done. And I mean, you see a lot of people doing this now because a lot of one of the big modern things which led to a lot of people abandoning just pure Rothbardianism was the migrant, or not Rothbardianism, but like Larkin Rose anarchism. You know who that is?
Yeah, I'm not too much of a fan of Larkin Roses anymore, kind of for that exact reason.
I met him in September, actually. He was doing an event in Philly, and then he was talking about like the troops or some shit, and he was like, oh, the reason they have PTSD and kill themselves is because they probably did something really bad and they feel bad about it. And it was just some dumb shit like that. And I remember back then I was like, oh, this is so cool. But I mean, yeah, so a modern reason that so many people have left just libertinism is that we see what happens with a migrant crisis when you have millions of people from an incompatible culture who share different norms, who act differently, who view women differently, who are just completely different. They're like almost a different species. When they flood into your countries, they're just we can't do that. And so the Larkin Rose types who are just like, oh, you know what? It's not okay to aggress against them because aggression is like the worst thing ever. And so it's just like, okay, like, and so he sits there and he's just like, oh, we have all our morals, we have this and that. It's like, I would rather be a quote unquote immoral person according to you rather than have my fucking country go to shit and turn into Africa. And so, I mean, Hopper realized these things. And I remember I read a Murray Rothbard quote where he said his views on immigration changed because originally it was like a more economics Larkin Rose position where he was like, oh, immigrants will come here, and if there's jobs, they'll tell people back home that it'll equilibrate from the market and this and that. And so he was talking just market fetishizing. And so you had that, and then later he said, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were like deliberate attempts by Russia, or not deliberate attempts, but there was like ethnic Russians were encouraged to flood Latvia and the other country that's by there. I don't remember its name. And it like diluted their language, their culture, traditions. And then he saw that and he was like, holy shit. And so that was one of the things that changed Murray Rothbard's view. And that's what moved him to more right-wing populism and kind of like not abandoning his views, but he just sort of like, but when you're at that late stage in your life, like in 1990s and you've been writing since 1960, if you go and recant everything you've said for decades, you look like a fucking retard. You know what I'm saying? You're just like, you know what, fuck that. I saw this one thing and everything I said. So, I mean, like, they have very good incentives to just kind of change their thing a little bit or jump through hoops to still justify their position. I feel that's what Hoppe does.
Yeah, well, I think we're essentially trying to defend the same thing here because I have the same problem. Yeah. I don't follow Larkin Rose as much, but I follow Jeffrey Tucker. But he's essentially the same as Larkin Rose. Yes. No, exactly. And I get in Twitter spats with friggin' Tucker sometimes because he'll try to he'll essentially say that Rothbard was like going senile and it's like, oh, if Murray had seen the evil racist right-wing populism that he had started today, it'd be this big thing. And like, no. He changed his views for exactly that reason. And so, but I think the way we're trying to go about defending it is what's the key difference here, because I think you can defend culture in terms of just property norms itself and not have to jump through this kind of your hoop of defending culture as property, because I feel like when you're
I don't claim it to be property. I feel like if you apply similar protections to culture as you would, although like on a gradient. So you have personal property, you apply the strictest protections to that. So when there's murder, rape, stuff that affects your personal property, you get the strictest sanctions for doing that. But then when you like burn down the house, you still get strict sanctions, but it's less strict than sanctions against yourself property. And so it's sort of on a gradient. So the further it goes from a person, the less strict the sanctions are for violating it. And so, I mean, this is what social conservatives do. So, like there's some towns that have banned sagging pants, and I mean, they say Republicans, they engage in like moralistic speech. They have they say like this is immoral. They just don't know how to elaborate social conservatism in a more precise language than gay marriage is an abomination. It's like, well, I mean, that's not an argument, like you may feel that, like you may have a strong disgust thing, but I mean, in reality, something like gay marriage, it's sort of like fraud, almost not fraud, but I mean, it's, we give tax breaks to couples, that we give tax breaks for kids to encourage family formation. And so you have gays who want to get married. And I mean, I have a few gay friends, but you have gays who want to get married. And they just want to reap those same tax benefits. They want to reap those same that same recognition that we give to straight couples who have kids. And so it's sort of like trying to like steal the sanction, or not the sanction, steal the prestige that we give to straight married couples, which prolong our civilization.
Okay, well, so that's kind of the thing I wanted to mention, because it feels like when you try to define property as something that can be defensible in some way, in a similar fashion to property, even though you might not technically call it that, it sort of lends itself to that moralizing and that kind of grandstanding, only because, again, culture is something that shifts. If it's something that's collectively owned on this mass scale, then what you consider to be culture and defending it will change, and you kind of allow it to be thrown to the will of majority. And essentially, you're allowing cultural democratizing in a sense, where I mean, yeah, I'm sure you've heard about Hoppe's hypothesis on why democracy is so horrible, like compared to like
Yeah.
but like so it's similar to that sense in a cultural sense, which I feel like is what much worse. And if you were to throw in property norms into something like defending culture, well, if Marxists become the dominant culture, then there go all property norms. So if you, rather than defending culture itself, if you promote kind of this essence of, private property, self-ownership, and not being, and you eliminate dependence on something like a state, essentially. Like, you don't have to eliminate the state, but if you stop subsidizing horrible behaviors, then eventually those who don't follow, the most effective cultural standards, which are kind of the property norms we're espousing here, then they'll just kind of, they won't be reproducing anymore, and they'll just kind of fall off the face of the earth. It's kind of, do you listen to Chris Cantwell at all?
Oh, every day. Like, I love that show.
Oh yeah, it's kind
That's
of.
why I heard you called in one time, and I was like, "Is that fucking Joe?"
Oh yeah, I've been doing a job lately, so it's not like I've been able to call in as much. But oh yeah, I try to call in as much as possible because he's really, he shaped my view on this thing, and I don't know if you saw his two latest videos, but it's kind of similar to what he espouses now, where property norms and shifting culture, especially in the presence of some monolithic entity like the state, can only be sort of done through a peaceful, gradual process. And when you try to bend something like the state to enforce cultural norms, well, unfortunately, we live in a hyper-inclusive mass democracy, so it's going to bend that the other way. And then if you just cut out the middleman and declare culture as a democratic system, well, you're just allowing people to morally justify defending their own hyper-individualistic culture. Well, not they might not have a hyper-individualistic culture, but you're allowing others to dictate what that culture should be, so to speak. You kind of get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get where you're coming from, but the point where what I wanted to make is, well, first off, like culture, it's not as until like the '60s, it hasn't shifted as rapidly as it has until you've seen things like what's it called, like the fucking Cultural Revolution, the Frankfurt School. You've seen this just like mass, until cultural Marxism, where you just use this just like lying bullshit, just like critiquing, it's just this critiquing and that method of analysis to culture. So I mean, it really is pretty stagnant. So it's fairly stagnant. So if you go back and you look at countries like Pakistan, this is really the only one I can speak about because that's where I'm from originally. Is that their cultures, their values, their traditions, their interpersonal norms, they've remained fairly stagnant for quite a while. And I mean, like, even countries like India, which have been growing very fast thanks to economic liberalization, like capitalism, basically, they still retain those same cultural norms. And I mean, it's really not as fast shifting as one would take it to be. So, I think, like, to use the United States' cultural revolution, which is really like it's an anomaly over the past 60 years. It's not like it's not what normally happens. So I mean, they're still they're still able to maintain similar gender dynamics in India. They're able to maintain similar family makeups that, it's very like extended family based. Like, the parent, like the son lives with the parents until he gets married, and then the parents come live with him. It's very like, so they're able to maintain that. And so basically what I'm saying is, when it is realizing that, oh yeah, back to the intellectual property real quick before we go on to this. Like, regardless of like what Austrians view as quote unquote legitimate or not, or just it's really the Misesian branch which looks at intellectual property that way. The Rothbardian branch that looks at intellectual property that way is, regardless of what they view as legitimate or illegitimate, if I have a patent for some sort of like new engine, car engine, that has a monetary value. And I mean, now someone can come, Jeffrey Tucker could come and say, oh, that's not real property because it's not, you hadn't homesteaded it and you can't homestead it. He'll say some shit like that. And I mean, but the fact is, I can still go sell it to ExxonMobil for $50 million. It's still inventoriable. I can still put it on a balance sheet. I can still um, write off tax. I can still get tax based off it. So for all practical purposes, it is an asset in that it's a value, a thing of value, which it holds value. It is used in productive processes. That's not all about an asset is, but I mean, it's valuable, and you
No,
can
I
trade it.
understand. I understand.
And another thing about the democracy thing. So what you have is kind of common property, and so that's kind of what norms fall under. And common property, they necessarily are less efficient. So when you see a corporation like McDonald's is a lot less efficient than a smaller restaurant where it's like a burger restaurant, And I mean, what happens is when you have these larger corporations, when you have like millions of shareholders, you have what's known as principal agent conflict. So the principal is the stockholders and the agent is like the board of directors, and there's a conflict of interest in between them. So you'll have these what's it called? My bad. One sec. So you'll have these agents who don't necessarily always act in the best interests of their principals. So you'll see big company jets. You'll see lavishly decorated offices in corporate headquarters. You'll see just a lot of extra money spending, which is not necessarily, like the best way to spend the money. And but I mean, this is inherent in these economies of scale. And so, and like just because it's not as efficient as a mom and pop burger shop, that doesn't mean that it has no utility as far as McDonald's as a corporation. That doesn't mean it has no utility as an investment, or it should not be taken into consideration because it's not the most efficient way to do it. So when you come to things like common property, and Kurt Doolittle defines the commons as that in which we have a non-quantifiable, non-tradable share in. So like when you have in like it is a negative commons, but the national debt, you have a non-quantifiable, non-tradable share in the national debt. Whether you want it or not, whether you can trade it away or you can't trade it away, but I mean it's still part of yours. And so the government, you kind of have, it's sort of like your common property in that it's a common institution in that you are a shareholder of it. And it's not like as efficient as a small business where all costs can easily be accounted for by one person and this and that, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily inefficient. So when we get to democracy and stuff like that, I very much agree with Hoppe and Cantwell that democracy kind of sucks. But I mean, there still are useful. There still is use for people to have a proportional say in what their government does. And so part of the reasons I think we need a government is, well, first off, I don't abide by the non-aggression principle. I don't think that aggression is inherently immoral, but that's like for another time. And so,
yeah, I was going to say I'm not the largest advocate of the strict adherence to the nap anymore either myself, but yeah, that's another
especially with Cantwell, because he's just like he's on the point where he just wants a fucking like race war. And like as a brown guy, I would be like, you know what, we should just stick to voluntary interactions and just like peaceful disassociation, because I'll find myself on the bad side of that. But
well, no, you're one of the high IQ ones, so it wouldn't matter.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I ate my Wheaties or something, but so and so he's really thrown it out the window. He's just like, you know what, like some things they need violence. And so one of the things that me and you have quibbled about is public goods. And I'm not saying the term public good in some like fucking Democrat type sense, like this is for the public good, but like economically a public good is that which are non-rival in consumption and those which are non-excludable in their benefit. So like national defense, it's like I can't exclude you from national defense. I can't say if you're not paying taxes, I can't just like if you're not contributing to it voluntarily.
Yeah.
Let's do that. I
You know,
can't say like don't protect Joe. You
yeah.
have
Could
to
I just
protect me.
reframe the conversation for a quick second? Because I just think we're getting a little bit away, and I just want to respond to some of the things you said before you have to go.
Oh right, yeah. So the social conserv. So it's basically so it's not very different. So the kind of like the proprietarian viewpoint is not very different from what you will see just regular social conservatives doing. So when you have norms like when you ban sagging pants, when you have public decency laws, when you have things like that, it's like there's a reason for that. It's not just like the state being oppressive. It's not just about like people trying to suppress the individual. It's just about like, look, this is how we conduct ourselves in our commons, and it degrades the value of our commons for people to be walking around naked, and it's just like unseemly, and it degrades the values of your commons. So you ban these types of activities, and you say like, look, we're not going to allow you to degrade the value of our commons essentially. And so that's kind
Yeah.
of what you have where with norms. It's like they're not the same category by any means as
Normal
physical
property.
property or this and that, but it's like it's so the way I've come to look at property is on a gradient. There's self, physical, then there's like then there's just like other things in which we invest that we seek to benefit from. And so I mean like so it's like and so I'm talking about norms in that sense. It's about preserving. And then Hoppe also recognizes this. And so when he says advocates of homosexual lifestyles, of democracy, of this and that, he recognizes that those degrade the value of his covenant. But Hoppe is just stuck. He's Murray Rothbard's mentee or
Yeah, yeah,
mentee or whatever. And so like he kind of and so since he's an old guy, he's kind of just like he made his theory. In my opinion, he knows that he's incorrect, and he's just kind of moved. He's just trying to just say this is my thing, and then he's just like gone off from public life. So he's not a public figure. So I think what he's
yeah.
done
That's a
is he's
bummer.
just yeah I'm actually going to see him in New York City in October or something. He's
Oh, for the
going to
Mises
speak
thing.
at yeah.
Okay, yeah,
That'll
I
be pretty
saw
sweet.
that. I mean, I don't think I could get away from school for that, but no, I won't talk about the intellectual property thing because that's a whole
Mm-hmm.
conversation on its own again. But just to respond to the one final thing you mentioned quickly, in terms of some unquantifiable term of stock that we own in the commons, like I don't disagree with the method you have of defending the commons, which is through exclusion and all these otherwise peaceful means of doing it. And I think if that's the only method you're proposing of defending it, that's fine. Because my larger problem is using force to defend something so subjective and so fluid. Like my problem isn't that, like that culture doesn't change that often. And like in the United States and Europe, the rapid culture change that we've experienced is an anomaly. That's not my problem with it. My problem is like government itself, it's the potential for abuse that worries me because, we're witnessing the state being massively abused as we speak. And
Mm-hmm.
so if we turn government culture, something so fluid and something undefinable and unquantifiable in your own words, kind of into a kind of democratic process, and that's something, we want to try to defend with actual force,
Mm-hmm.
then that's where it kind of goes sour because then you can have ideologues who assert their intellectual superiority into the culture, and that's where you start to go downhill real fast. And even if you don't
Mm-hmm.
have the presence of a state necessarily to enforce that, like if you wanted to try to enforce a culture using, say, some kind of private defense firm or something,
Mm-hmm.
well, then that makes it even worse almost because you have now a bunch of independent cultures rather than trying to peacefully coexist, saying my culture is the norm, and we as a collective have this large undefinable stock that you have to be adherent to. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's like I understand, we both understand the need for a defense of culture because of that kind of group identity, and it's necessary. It's just that if your only proposition is defending culture through exclusion and just hopefully these people become, so excluded that they just kind of die off, then yeah, I'm with you on that. But if it's something where it's kind of like enforcing social conservatism through force, then it becomes open to abuse. Like the opportunity is there.
But if you look at the differences in what you and I say, so I mean, let's say that. Well, no, first let me get back to commons. So what I meant about commons is that since they are unquantified, your ownership in the commons is unquantifiable, it's untradeable. Those are necessarily going to be less efficient than the production of like shoes, the way Tom Woods likes to say all the time. So, those so they will be less efficient. So when you have like McDonald's, like the corporation, that is going to be less efficient. So, like I recognize that the production of public goods, the defense of what's it called, of just like commonly held assets from which we benefit, they're not going to be as efficient. And I mean, and so I mean, the
Well, I don't
best way
necessarily disagree. I don't agree with the McDonald's analogy because I don't believe McDonald's is any less efficient than a mom and pop business. It's larger, but I mean, it wouldn't be this as successful as it is
well,
if
its
it weren't.
long-term average costs are a lot. It's a long run. It's what's it called? Its average total costs are higher than the average total cost. That's just like the kind of that model.
Oh, well, yeah. Well,
right?
that's you do anything on a massive scale, and that's going to
Yeah.
happen. I wouldn't chalk that up to an inefficiency. I'm not saying McDonald's is at peak efficiency or at the minimum profit point. I forget exactly what it's called, but it's just that when you have things on such a large scale, it's going to be that way. And I think the point with
Yeah.
like military defense, like yeah, obviously the state enforces national defense, and you can't exclude me from that. And it's not exactly something I asked for, but I recognize the need for a national defense because we have a nation state, so it's necessary. But I think once you start to break away from the idea that we need a state to enforce property norms and culture norms, you start to realize that you can have defense, and if you have just a bunch of people living in a covenant society without a nation state, then national defense comes irrelevant. Now, how we get to a point without a nation state, that too is another conversation. But I don't think saying that, we have a state and therefore we need to all pay into this undefined common stock. That is kind of social contract theory in essence, which I don't.
No, I never advocate a social contract. I mean, like the way I go about it is like, yeah, government's violence. And I mean, the thing is, I don't try to moralize it away by saying, oh, you actually subconsciously agree to being here. Like I understand that it's violence, but it's just the thing is that like I don't necessarily think that it's inherently immoral the way a lot of anarchists think. And but I mean, and so what I mean with Walmart is that when you have such a large organization, when you have a lot of points where there can be waste and there's inefficiencies versus when you have a mom and pop store, it's a very small operation, so you can be a lot more cognizant of the waste and inefficiencies, and there's like a lot there's a lot less there are a lot less barriers in between someone noticing a waste of product or waste of whatever and communicating to someone who can make a change. So if some like random McDonald's worker just notices that like we lose a lot of oil the way we fry our fries or some shit like that, between him and whoever is like McDonald's chief of COO, chief of operations, them communicating to that and making a change, that's going to be there are higher barriers for that to happen. So there are a lot more opportunities in a large company organization for there to be inefficiencies. And so small. So when I say a smaller one, they just have they're just a lot more cognizant, since command is a lot more localized, to be cognizant of just waste, inefficiency, etc. And so what I'm saying is that like again about norms as property, it's like where this is the reason I don't like the term property, is because people have a distinct connotation with the term property, and they have they just have a predisposition to how they speak about it. So I mean, so for like a Rothbardian or a Hoppe supporter like yourself, you the way you view property and have for however long is just like this is my land, and like I can kill anyone who not kill anyone, but like you can retaliate strongly
you
against
violate
anyone
my
who
rights, I can
trespasses.
violate yours, that kind of deal.
Yeah, and so that's why. So you have a very so like your view of property is very different. That's why I really just don't like property. I've spoken to Kurt about this a few times, but he was like, "Yeah, that's why I say property in toto," and I'm like, that still doesn't people view they have like and so like a Marxist they call property like means of production, but something like a toothbrush they're like, oh no, that's just those are just your personal effects. So they have just from the get-go they have a very negative conception of when you say property. They have very negative biases towards that term. So when you say the word property to a Marxist, he's going to be like, ew, gross, and he's just going to be revulsed by it. So it's not really useful in communication. So, but basically what I'm saying is that and so have you seen that paper about multiculturalism and social cohesion?
Oh, by Putnam?
Yeah.
I haven't part of it. I actually I saw a video by the guy. Do you know the old edgy Sphinx, Braving Ruin?
No, I haven't.
He did he used to be around, then he left and now he's back. But long story short, he did a video where he took some excerpts from Bowling Alone, which was kind of like an expansion on that paper. And I've read excerpts from Bowling Alone, so I know the gist and I know some of the statistical backing behind what Putnam said.
And so yeah, basically like I'm not sure if it was exactly Putnam, I forget where it was, but which one it was exactly, but it basically just showed as there were multiple cultures in a certain polity, you have declining levels of social cohesion. You have people are less likely to contribute to, like, less likely to volunteer, less likely to contribute to the commons or whatever. They're less likely to have pro-social behaviors. And so so from that you can intuit that, like, we don't want to do this. But I mean, it's hard to make exact bounds as to XYZ thing is worth defending, and we're going to defend it by XYZ policy and XYZ sanction. So but I mean, like, that does not mean that your social cohesion is something that you do not want to decay. You know what I'm saying? So I mean, like, and it's like, so that's why you necessarily take a socially conservative look at it. And so when you have your prohibitions on, so let's say we have 1950s America, and so if instead of wanting to be socially, so rather than adopting gay marriage, so you have your norms and your sanctions and whatever. And so instead of adopting gay marriage, you just take the conservative route about it, because you don't know exactly how it's going to decay your society, but you do know that this is a strong deviation from what you've done. So what you say is, no, we're not going to allow this. This is not what we're about. This is that it's a clear violation of your norms, and that it's something it's not precise the way the way calculations for like a piece of land would be. It's a lot less imprecise. So I mean, that's why you have social conservatism, is that you just generally just don't really change, and your policies and your societies are just that you're just resistant to change. So when people say Republicans are just dinosaurs living in the 50s, or they're living in some old era, it's just like they just don't want to change. They just don't want gay marriage. They don't want gay wedding cakes. They don't want mostly gay stuff. They don't want Hispanics coming in and speaking. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, like, I've read papers about weed. There have been some demonstrated externalities on the hospital system. Yeah. And so, I mean, like, I'm not really as much of so even with weed and stuff, it's just like, like Indiana, that's where I'm from originally, the U.S., they're going to be like the last state to allow weed or anything. They're very socially conservative. That's where Mike Pence is from. So
my boy, Electric Fence Pence represent.
Yeah. So, and so, like, that's kind of how you deal with it. But I mean, but you're still able to intuit that you have some sort of useful thing. You can't really see it. It's intangible. So you don't know how to properly value it. It's in the same thing in the field of finances with intangible investments, with like patents and this and that. It's like known that it's not very precise of a valuation. Compared to like a piece of capital equipment, we've seen so much data about this. We know this will provide us XYZ cash flow, so we'll value it at this much. So you really don't know, but it's still something worth preserving. You know what I'm saying? And so when you
I feel like we're agreeing on this point essentially. I just think so. I think the big difference is here. So I just want to I think this is my big question. when you talk about defending culture, and we both agree that, and we both agree that one of those methods is specifically excluding those who don't live up to our norms, and hopefully through the process of exclusion, through essentially what's kind of they won't get any resources from us. They'd have to go somewhere that accepts their norms, or if they don't find anywhere, eventually they'll just cease to exist, as will people like them. But now, are you also proposing that there be some kind of enforcement of like police actually used to stop people from smoking weed or from stopping gay couples from being together? Are you proposing that as well, or no?
Well, that kind of depends on the nature of the action. So, I mean, when it comes to the externalities related to smoking weed are related to, like higher use of emergency services, drunk driving, this and that. But I mean, gay marriage, it's like you just don't recognize it, so you don't get the tax benefits or whatever. So you don't really need to do prohibitive things. But I mean, when it comes to something like public order, when it comes to just like public decency, this and that, what you do is you find them and you say, don't do this. It's just like a light nudge, sort of. It's just like, if you do this, you get $100 fine. You're not going to go to prison or anything for it, but I mean, like, you still do that, and it's a good way of prodding people to act a certain way and to uphold the way that people act. And so, I mean, so like, you defend norms by doing little shit like that. You just say, when there's public nudity, for public nudity, I think you get arrested, but it's like an infraction, but they arrest you.
Yeah, just for like a short period of time.
Yeah, but it's not like you go to prison or anything. And so, I mean, like, that's how you defend norms. And so you defend them through subtle prodding. So it's not like you broke this norm, you're going to get shot or anything like that. It's just, you break them through prodding. You don't allow loitering. That's another big one. It's like, no loitering in public parks. You're not allowed to be in public parks after 8 p.m. where I'm from, because they don't want people just smoking weed there and just having homeless people shoot up and shit. And they defend them by just basically like, you have cops, they go by public parks and they say, hey, get out of here. You're not allowed to be here. And so it's like a light enforcement, but I mean, you still do use violence. And I mean,
yeah,
you still do find people, and you still say, here's $100 fine for sagging your pants and looking like a degenerate. Don't do that. And so through those means, you prod people to do it. And so, I mean, it's not like, you steal a car and then you go to prison. It's less of it's nowhere near as valuable as physical property, but and so, I mean, the methods of enforcing it is different. And so basically, it's like, if you and so, yeah, again, like, I don't really claim it to be property, but I do claim it to be an asset from which we benefit and which we contribute to through adherence and whatnot. And so, and I think that those should be defended. And I mean, and the way this looks is, it looks just like a social conservative Indiana type thing. It's not like some Nazi type thing where you're sterilized. It's not anything crazy like that, but it's what you've noticed in the real world. So what Kurt Doolittle tries to do, proprietarians try to do, is they try to translate this language of conservatives into like they try to make it commensurable. So they try to give it like as much of a yardstick as possible from which you can measure actions and you can measure adherence and inadherence and how to solve it. And so, yeah, and so basically it's like, those are worth protecting. And like Hoppe, the reason I think he's different is he just has so much invested in his worldview that he can't just come out and say, I'm a Republican now.
Well, I think you won't say he's a Republican for a lot of reasons. One of them being most Republicans are fucking pussies. But besides that, I think we want to defend the same things. The thing I would say is, rather than having this mass collectivization of norms and having them defended on this massive kind of scale, I'd say have each individual defend their own norms on their own property. Because, you'd want to find someone who's just nude. You wouldn't let them be nude on your property. But rather than, say, having this big government-owned park and making the government enforce it, privatize the park and say, let the person whose
Well,
property.
that gets the public to common ownership. You know what I'm saying? So norms are
Well, I think we
enforced on the
eliminate.
common ownerships.
I don't think we need common ownership of anything necessarily, and I guess this is more. I guess this is a.
That's where we deviate.
Yeah,
But
I don't think
and
there.
so my advocacy basically is to defend our social portfolio and what comprises it through this sort of light prodding of people. And I kind of view people as cattle, sort of. It's not really. I mean, it's like what a lot of people. No, that's a crude way of putting it, but it's like you kind of prod them to do what you do. Like you force them to be productive members of society by uh, eliminating any option for them to do otherwise. You force them to compete in the marketplace and to work in the marketplace by jailing them or killing them if they prey upon others. You know what I'm saying? You force them
No, yeah,
into doing that. So you make it the cheapest option for them is to compete in the marketplace and not to be a predator. And so, I mean, I view similar norms in similar ways. So if you have most of your population, and so it's not really mass collectivization, but it's more of just like those are common property. And so, I mean, like enforcement of norms, they really do just apply to like common property. And so that's like the main thing. And I would not make the case for privatization of roads and this and that.
yeah. I guess
I know you're
that's
gonna
the big point of disagreement. Then would be
freaking
because I
out,
mean,
yeah.
like I agree that all the norms you're talking about have been massively beneficial to society and that they should be defended. It's just that when you try to, it is essentially when you have common property, it's not really common property. It is, in one sense, it is government owned, and government is a collective because it's a democracy, and so it is collectivized at the end of the day. And so that's why I say rather than having this ever changing, ever fluid, hyper inclusive mass democracy decide what norms are to be enforced, privatization allows for those norms to be enforced by the individual, so you don't have to worry about going through some massive body, and that way individuals with undesirable norms will be naturally excluded by every other individual. And so individuals will still naturally form communities, and in that way the most successful communities are the ones that are going to continue to thrive, and those will be the ones with the norms we're talking about.
Well,
And
but I'm saying like the covenant communities, it's just a roundabout way of doing this thing of just enforcing norms by saying, you signed my huge contract which stipulated everything you got to do and live here. And it's like within a few generations, if you have like this private property monarchy, the way Hoppe advocates, you're going to have a large disconnect between the sovereign and the subjects. So if,
well, I don't even think that necessarily the private property monarchy is even necessary. I think if you were to turn literally every individual and their property into their own country today, I still think it would be more efficient that way, only because that way, you have a bunch of individuals who of their own will decide they're not going to allow nudity on their property. And it kind of ends up being like, you good?
But you're stuck in the whole voluntary thing of things. You're stuck in the whole voluntary worldview. You're like, well, they'll decide voluntarily and they'll do this voluntarily. It's like, what's useful about voluntary interaction?
It's
like
just
specifically,
what's
like voluntary interaction sends good signals in the marketplace. It's just like, what to produce because what people voluntarily consume. So for the production of private goods, voluntary interaction is useful, but in other spheres, it's just like it doesn't really matter whether. I just don't think it really matters if something is voluntary or not.
Well, if you have, to some extent, I agree, and I mean, like Hoppe, there needs to be a culture shift. Not either of the societies we're talking about right now aren't going to emerge either tomorrow or even within the next few decades, because right now there kind of needs to be a culling of the herd. There needs to be a bunch of people who can handle at least the level of individualism you're talking about, and hopefully someday the level of individualism I'm talking about. But what makes voluntarism useful, no, I hate that word, but what makes voluntary interaction useful on the cultural stage is that when people feel like they're being forced to follow certain norms, they're more likely to rebel against them in the first place. I mean, that's how the whole counterculture of the 60s and 70s evolved in the first place. Hippies felt like they were revolting against the system, which was enforcing these harsh social norms. And, they weren't harsh, but they felt that. And that's kind
well,
of,
there was an
and that,
abnormal influence that got in there.
yeah, communism, I forget the name of that Russian spy who talked about how long it took to indoctrinate the youth and things like that.
Yeah.
I'm not denying there were external influences, but there have been plenty of psychological papers published to the point that it's, if you're an overbearing, it depends on the individual again, but if you, in the average case, if you're overbearing on what you want, say, your child to do and how strictly you enforce the rules, they're just going to kind of become that bad, rebellious, obnoxious child simply to rebel against mommy and daddy, even though what mommy and daddy want is probably actually best for them. If they're going to go about it in a stupidly, I guess, authoritarian manner, you're going to end up with that revolt. So the voluntary interaction ensures that through, just natural selection, the free market, the best culture will naturally emerge. And I think that would be the type of individualism that you and I are talking about.
Yeah, but I mean, the free market is. So this is another thing which I wanted to get on. Is like the free market alone is just that you're allowed to exchange. It doesn't. So like my view on economics kind of is that you just have generally a free market, but you have the reason you have government is to control externalities and to regulate so that you don't have so people can operate, but they're still held accountable to the externalities that they ship off to other parties. And so just like this sense of like, a free market of culture, it's like, that would, if that was true, then like you wouldn't care about immigration restriction because they're going to see our Western culture and say, oh, this is so superior, look how successful they are, free markets of ideas, it doesn't pan out that way. So when you have norms, it's really about when you have like a mass influx of people, it's just like you have more people that adhere to this. They want that, like, and it withers. So it's like, it's not as durable as like a piece of land. And so, just to like, you can't just like argue, say like, the free market is going to find the best efficient solution when it's like, that's not, there are externalities which markets on their own cannot control. And which is why I know even you in your covenant community would want to regulate and control for it.
Well, to the extent that there are externalities, I've always been, whether it be in economics or even in culture, I've always found that the extent to which externalities have been made a problem have always been overstated. Like, especially like just for an economic example to start with, if you have a house by, say, a railroad or something, or a track of trains, and that's kind of where I used to live by, the price of the houses in that area are going to drop because of the noise pollution. And so that externality is naturally accounted for in the price of the house. Same if you were to live by, say, a factory that produced massive amounts of smog. If you live next to that factory and the smog is in your neighborhood, the prices of those houses are going to naturally drop. And, so the price accounts for the externalities. Now, in terms of culture, again, it kind of goes back to voluntary association. If you see someone whose lifestyle comes with these externalities, like, certain aspects of, say, the gay culture comes with certain, a higher likelihood for diseases such as AIDS, or if you're even more like the promiscuous liberal type gay, just more sexual diseases in general. And on top of that, you tend to have a higher time preference, as I think it was either Hoppe or Rothbard pointed out, like that's probably what influenced Keynes's theory is, because he was gay and so he had a high time preference. But like there, those externalities are something people naturally notice in each other. And again, they're going to just choose to naturally disassociate from that to the point where eventually these people are they're either going to have to adapt so that they can attain the resources that people otherwise wouldn't give them because of the disassociation, or they'll choose to die with their lifestyle. And in terms of, massive cultural shifts like what you get from immigration, those are only possible through state action, essentially, or state inaction in some cases, when they allow this mass importation to happen in the first place. Because if you were to say, if you privatized all the properties on the borders, or if you privatized literally every morsel of land on the states of like, California, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, then you'd have a lot more people who are protective of those regions, and they as individuals would be more defensive of letting people just cross those borders. And so I think these are solutions that you can reach individually without necessarily saying we should throw it to the commons and let, the majority aside, which is always what happens when you have a situation of commons.
All right, now let me get to the economic thing. It's like I realize that externalities are accounted for in prices. That's not what I was saying. I was saying that devaluation of your property, like let's say I have a house that's worth $100,000, and then a factory starts polluting, and then my house loses 30% of its value. That's $70,000, and then you just said, oh, like it's accounted for. It's like the externality there is that I lost $30,000 because of the actions of the factory. It devalued my house by 30%, and that's an externality which we look for to the government to control against. So what you then have is you have the government say, you're not allowed to make this factory here, or you force them to pay people X amount of dollars, however much their house devalues, if they are gonna do it. So the negative externality in that sense is the devaluation of the house. And then with the culture thing, it's like, again, people do not act that way. We're like, oh, like this is really cool. Like, they have these norms. It's like the only reason I am like normed into like America is because I just grew up in like not southern Indiana, but like south central Indiana, and around basically just like all white people. So I was like normed into that. But if I grew up in Pakistan, I would be a completely different person. And so on the other hand, about the people about the what's it called, the immigrants, is that it's like, yeah, it's true that a big part of it is what's it called? A big part of it is welfare migrants, shit like that. But another part of it is just like, you can still degrade social. So you can have like East Asian immigrants. They're high functioning. They're not aggressive. They have low testosterone. So they're not aggressive. They don't like run around raping people. They're like studious, this and that. But they have a distinct and different culture, different norms. I mean, like if you've ever been in one of those Chinese buffets, you have a whole like it's not like, it's very different. And so you can still like subsist, but still have like a multicultural thing. So it's not, so when we view multiculturalism, we view it as just like a bunch of Mexicans looking to come here illegally and get food stamps, and the only reason they're able to subsist is because of those food stamps. But it's like you can still have these negative effects of worse social cohesion, even if you can have high IQ immigrants come in, and they don't norm to your culture. So you can have a bunch of high IQ Chinese people come in, and as far as aggression, as far as welfare use, as far as all this and that, they're good to go. So people don't really have a problem with them. But I mean, their issue was more subtle in that when they form their own little communities or Chinatown, they kind of like balkanize. They can like balkanize your area. So San Francisco, there's entire neighborhoods that are just Chinese, and like you'll walk down them, you're just like, am I even in America anymore? And so and so I mean, you can still degrade social cohesion, and you can still degrade those even if you don't have any welfare. So there are it's a lot. It's not as bad because you're not bringing in like fucking Nigerians and you're giving them a bunch of welfare. It's like not as bad, of course, I'll give you that. But I mean, there is still that decay in culture and social cohesion that you have. The answer to this is that what you can do is you can just kind of mandate norming. So you can mandate them to learn English. You can mandate them to kind of just like, you can have quotas of how many people come into your country so that they don't form their own big communities and just like, just basically like carve out their own area. And so, I mean, it's just like, but I mean, like they're less important, but it's not just linked to welfare. And so, I mean, so what you have with like Pakistanis, this is like a thing which has come to me recently, is that, like Pakistan is the accumulated inheritance of, like the Pakistani people. They have demonstrated that they cannot create a nation. They cannot create, well, they're not a very good one. They've demonstrated they cannot manage commons, and they cannot do these types of things versus the Anglos, the British, like Europeans, they have demonstrated that they want to. And you can see that because everyone wants to come to Europe and America. And so what you're doing then is you're basically, you are just coming to the accumulated capital structure, normative structure of a new nation, and then you were just inserting yourself in there, and then unless you reciprocally contribute to those norms of that nation and norm yourself into there, and you like really assimilate, you are just basically profiting off of the capital structure, the culture, and their cultural climate and everything, and without reciprocal reinvestment. So what you have is you could still have problems. It's not as bad as like bringing in like black people basically, but you know, it's you still have negative effects which need to be controlled. And just saying like, oh, you know, if you take away welfare it'll be fine, it's like there are still issues. It's not as bad.
No,
Welfare
I
is
get
like
what you're saying.
terrible.
I think what you're advocating for is, especially in the current situation we have, necessary. Like, I don't mind using, you know, one way or another, a realization I eventually came to when I moved out of kind of my libertarians for dummy phase, which is kind of like what most people call like being a libertine or a lubertarian. I think.
Yeah, my friend came up with that term from Instagram.
Oh yeah, I think that guy T came up with it a while ago because I saw him throwing it around on Twitter. But
Oh, nice.
it's, you know, it's something you realize that, you know, just because something is voluntary doesn't mean it shouldn't necessarily be defamed. Like, being voluntary is kind of like a base standard. And, you know, because we have a state and we don't have complete voluntary interaction, you know, one way or another, either the state's going to be used against you or you are going to use it against others. And so what you're proposing, I don't mind as a temporary phase to kind of thin the herd, as we've been talking about, so that we get people who are actually capable of maintaining a sort of libertarian social order and who will live up to these norms and these kind of things. My larger problem with it is, though, you know, there's a point for which, you know, you mentioned the factory being built and devaluing your house. Well, most of the time it isn't government who says the factory can't be built there. It's government who says, all right, it can only be built within X distance, but you can still put it there. Like, government doesn't actually do the best job of defending people because the power can be bought off by special interests and large corporations and stuff. And so the best way of not doing that is, you know, if you form a covenant society which you own stock in, then you can say outright, no, you're just not building it here. This is a residential area. Whereas if you have government, you're kind of bribing that power. And the same thing if you continue to have a state and you let it dictate culture. You can bribe it and have it change. And so even though, yes, you're still having that devaluation, you can prevent that devaluation from happening in the first place. With a state, it's only a matter of time before they allow that devaluation to happen. And so another thing, my point with like immigrants isn't that, it's kind of the same thing. It's not that I expect them to adopt the culture because free market. I expect them, you know, they're just not going to get here at all because people see before they even arrive. You know, like, I don't believe in freedom of movement anymore. I mean, in a private property society, freedom of movement just isn't a thing because there are, you know, borders of property that you won't allow people to cross through them. So my point isn't that necessarily immigrants are going to adopt the culture because they see it's so great, more so that we see their culture in advance before they even arrive, and they will be prevented from arriving and degrading the culture in the first place.
Yeah. But okay, so another thing is that, like, what's it called? It's like you kind of assume that only government people can be bought off. I mean, even in your private property community, people can be bought off. And I mean, it's not, corruption isn't limited to government, you know? I mean,
no, I don't doubt that. It's just when you have if you've signed a contract already, like you mentioned, then there are terms and there can be private courts that enforce those terms and private defense firms. Like, the thing about government is government is a monopoly on force one way or another. And so if government edicts something and they've already been bought off, you don't have anyone else to go to in the land. You have, you know, if you privatize courts or defense forces or what have you, you have a lot more options. And so if you see, you know, there's this one really corrupt covenant society or court or whatever, you can leave that area eventually. Or if you think they're really violating it, you can bring in another court or another private property system. And because violence really isn't that efficient, there's going to be a peaceful means of resolving it at some point or another. Not, you know, it's kind of like what David Friedman talks about in his book, Machinery of Freedom. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen that video of him discussing how private courts would work, but essentially violence isn't like a cost-effective way of solving things. And so you know, I'm not saying there isn't going to be a period of relative instability. Like I said, we need to cull the herd. But once you get to people who eventually understand that, it's not the best way of going about things, then eventually you reach that point. Like, I'm not, again, it's kind of like I'm for what you're proposing, but only as a temporary solution. Like, eventually we kind of have to move away from it.
Well, and so the thing I wanted to get upon is that, like, a private property community, it's like, so I mean, like, the thing is, like, another reason I'm against private property communities is, although you can some way regulate the shit that goes on in there, you can't regulate your exterior. So I mean, I do believe in a national defense and that in protection from invasion, because other countries have demonstrated that they are aggressive, that they do look to expand their territory. And so I mean, so a military is a public good is like, you cannot as efficiently fund a military by through some covenant community. And there are a lot of efficiencies that come from the scale of the United States and that in its domination in international affairs. So I've seen I forget the source, but it was basically just measuring the number of wars and number of conflicts that happened during the Soviet era when the world was bipolar, and before like World War II, and the number of conflicts that occurred after the United States assumed basically hegemony over international affairs, is that you had a sharp decrease in international conflicts once there was like one head honcho and there weren't two competing people fighting for dominance. And
Well,
so,
I think that kind of, I don't know. I look at that and I think to some degree it's more correlation than causation with the United States, because also coinciding with the United States' rise to the absolute foreign policy power has also been the rise of capitalism and markets and this kind of people's solution sort of mentality. And so, while I'm sure, obviously having one massive protectorate helps, I don't think that's sufficient to say it's only been the U.S. which has led to that steep decline. There's also, like, have you heard of golden arches theory?
no.
It's essentially this theory where any two countries with a McDonald's are less likely to go to war with each other because they're a part of the same economic supply chain. And I feel like that's sort of a more accurate reason as to why you see less countries going to war, because they're all reliant on each other economically. Like before, when you had heavy nationalism and, like super high tariffs and things like that, a nation was meant to be as self-sustained as possible. But now that you kind of have globalization, not globalism, big difference.
Wait, could you repeat what you just said? I cut out.
Oh, okay.
You
have different countries
nationalism.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So when nations were super nationalistic and they had awesome, ridiculous high tariffs, they needed to be self-dependent and they needed to keep going to war to resources because they didn't rely on other countries for them. But now that you have globalization, not globalism, globalization, big difference. But, and now that you have,
a lot of people don't know that difference. It pisses me off.
Yeah, that's stupid. But now that you have people a part of the same economic supply chain and reliant on each other, then they're less likely to go to war because, again, they're reliant on each other. It's part of an economic alliance, an unspoken economic alliance, so to speak. And in that sense, I feel like that I would contribute less wars. No doubt the U.S. has played a part in that, but I'd contribute it more so to the economic theory of it and less to the United States in particular.
Well, I mean that only. Wait, did you read the thing I wrote in response to ANCAP Outlaw about private courts and this and that?
I read it this morning, so I'm a bit fuzzy on it. But I read it, yeah.
Yeah. Well, basically, it was just kind of like saying that, like, without a sovereign, which is a person who has liberty because of his force of arms, because no one can deny it from him, those are the ones who quash petty squabbles. And so what he said about privatized defense is like, when you have factions in your society, when you have armed factions pursuing the same restitution, this and that, you can have his argument was basically that, because I was talking about Robert Murphy when he came on Tom Woods' show. He was saying that what's it called? He was like, oh, there's going to be a private judge that people hire, and if people don't go to trial, they're going to be tried at absentia. Then once he delivers an edict or a verdict, the early man agency, and they'll go kick in someone's house and kick in someone's door, and because they have a verdict from that judge, no one's going to object. And so what I was saying was that all you need to do is like have someone who's able to make it costly enough to make enforcement not happen. So you can have even someone who's not even necessarily a rich person, but just someone who's poorer, like if some like what we call rednecks, is like they can just muster enough force of arms to make enforcement too costly. Or you can have a rich person who just has his little like guards, and he's just like, no, fuck off, I'm not gonna go. And so it just makes it too costly to enforce. And so I mean, what we have in the current society is the government. They are the supreme sovereign. Like they have more force of arms than anyone else, and because of that, you don't have this kind of faction and conflict in society. And so basically, and then NCAP Outlaw, he's just like, people, they're going to have a bad reputation, and so people are going to not associate with them. And I said to him, like, anarchists, they really over exaggerate the usefulness of reputation, and they really over exaggerate, how much that plays into a thing. So, like, let's say I'm like,
Well, my point wouldn't be reputation. Like I see what you're going with it, where you're going with this, and I see your point absolutely because reputation is only a part of it. I've always argued that
yeah,
if people deem what you're doing, even if they deem it's despicable, but they'll still buy from you, well, then you have to deal with that. But I mean, even beyond that, if you decide that the law doesn't apply to you, the law doesn't apply to you. And so my point for private courts would be not so much that people will just disregard the law and then nothing will happen. It's just that if if they choose to disregard the law, then others can just choose to ignore the law themselves. Because if you have this one guy who's going to live a lawless life and do whatever he wants, people are going to do whatever they want to him. And you can't even, no matter how much power one individual has, if a majority of people are pissed off at him, they can't resist. As Murray Rothbard once wrote, I think it was in Anatomy of the State. You can't resist an active majority. And so if one dude is pissing off all these people through his consistent actions, then eventually they are going to become the active majority. And no matter how much power he has in the first place, he's going to get overthrown. But even before that, what I would say is, after we've kind of gone through your steps of enforcing these norms to the point where everybody has kind of ingrained them, so to, just in their minds, like it's sort of written in on their DNA unofficially. What you have is something where people realize at that point in society that conflict is just, like you said, it's stupidly inefficient. It's incredibly it's incredibly wasteful. And so people seek the peaceful resolution anyway, just because they don't want to waste the resources on the conflict in the first place. And so rather than have these warring factions, you'll have sort of more a peaceful multilateral court system. So, it's again, something I agree we're not culturally ready for it yet. Like, I think what you're proposing is a necessary step, but I think after that, we can move away from it. Like, I don't think that's impossible.
well, I mean, also it's like you have a higher trust society, you have higher IQ society, you have a demonstrably lower demand for authority versus a country like Pakistan where it's like
Exactly.
84 IQ people. They need like prodding, they need heavy prodding, but you don't need that in some like small white town basically, because people are just like, they're generally just like better people. And I hate to say it like that, but I mean, they're just like, they're more conscientious. They have more empathy. They're more aware of their surroundings and this and that. But
No,
I mean,
yeah, I agree
and
exactly.
so
Sorry, you go.
and so, but what I meant though was that the reason, and so what happens in those kind of situations is when there's a lot of conflict, people do realize that it is. So what they do instead is they create supranational entities like the League of Nations, the whatever the fuck Europe had. They create the UN. They try to like mitigate their things. And so what the natural progression of humanity is to just have someone above them who can impose order. And I mean, it has worked out. So what you have, what's a lot more likely in some anarchist society is a bunch of the rich people get together and they say like, look, let's just combine our force of arms, create like a little parliament of us, and then just fucking overpower others and just kind of like and then impose law and order. And so I mean, when you have that's a lot more likely than just some rogue guy being like, well, I'm gonna drink and drive and whatever, and I don't care what you say.
I
That's
would
a lot more
disagree
likely to
that
happen.
I would disagree that the natural progression is just that people choose to put more people on top of them. Like, I agree there's a form of hierarchy that's necessary. Like, I mean, corporations and businesses have hierarchies, and that's a thing I still believe in. But I don't think necessarily that it needs to be a force which they give supreme monopoly of, control over, like through a police force or something. I think it's still, like I mentioned, I think capitalism has prevented more wars than the United States as a superpower has. I mean, again, the United States has contributed, but I think the fact that nations are more reliant on each other in terms of an economic supply chain has done more to do that. And I think you can apply that not only on a national level, but on an individual level. And some level, so you could have one of two situations, essentially. Either someone's going to be reliant on you somewhere in their economic supply chain, whether you supply them with the most basic of labor, or, they're your boss and you work for them. And, that's going to keep people peaceful. And then you have the flip side of that coin, where if society is made of just a bunch of assholes, see, that's another thing I get from that. It's like, oh, you're only relying on society being full of good people. Well, no, because there's two sides to the coin. If everybody is a good person in kind of the society I'm proposing, then you just don't need that force, and people will seek to resolve things peacefully. But if everybody
have a lower demand for authority,
exactly. But if everybody's an asshole, then out of their own self-interest, they're going to choose not to be assholes to people because they don't want anyone to be an asshole back to them. Because again, your violation of someone else's rights dictates their own violation. Like, the second I violate your rights, it's okay for you to violate mine. And people are, one way or another, people are aware of that. And so so if everybody's an asshole, that's what's going to keep them peaceful. And if they're just peaceful, good people naturally, well, again, then there's going to be the low demand for authority in the first place. So one way or another.
But that doesn't happen, though. You don't have these sort of like you don't have these sort of like this like far thinking, these like long-term thinking people. So, I mean, otherwise there wouldn't be problems like that in Pakistan. Everyone would be like, hey, let's just voluntarily go into capitalism. Like, people don't operate like that. They kind of rare for people to operate like that. And I mean, for the majority of the human condition, majority of the human experiment, or whatever the fuck, for the majority of the human experience, I mean, they just have not operated that way. And so, I mean, what they do is, the way people act is they do whatever's their cheapest option. So, I mean, sometimes predation is cheaper, sometimes parasitism is cheaper, sometimes cooperation is cheaper. And so, I mean, if you take the example of Iraq and Kuwait, like Saddam Hussein, he didn't have like autarky, like he didn't have high trade barriers or anything. He was just like, hey, I can benefit from these oil fields. It's not going to be that expensive for me to subdue them. I'm just going to take them over. And I mean, that was his cheapest option. I mean, like, he kind of like fucked himself over in that. But I mean, like, conflicts do happen. And I mean, people aren't just like, hey, let's voluntarily trade in this and that. So people, because like, if people acted like that, you would have had anarchism like thousands of years ago.
I don't think the problem is that I don't think the issue is that, Saddam peacefully trading with Kuwait wouldn't have been cheaper. I certainly think that would have been cheaper than the massive amount of lives he wasted and the oil fields he burnt. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is, people are too low IQ to realize what the cheapest option is. And that's why I like what you're talking about, where we kind of, I don't know how many times I've said this on this stream so far, but, we need to cull the herd. We need to get rid of the people who aren't smart enough to realize that peace is the cheapest option. And eventually we can get to the society I'm talking about. But until then, the society you're talking about is necessary.
That's like a centuries long thing. Like, because I mean, there was like a research that went into into medieval England's use of the death penalty, and around like 1000 AD, 1100 AD, they just started not mass executed, but they started being really liberal with the death penalty. So every year, like 0.5% of the male population another 0.5% of them was killed on the scene of the crime. And so they had a murder rate at like 40 per 100,000. And so over centuries, the murder rate of England, it went down to like what it is, like 3 or 4 per 100,000. So, I mean, the domestication of man is a centuries long thing. And so, I mean, as far as talking about, just like, so basically there are steps towards a lower, like to a less government state. And I mean, those steps are like centuries long. And so, I
Oh
mean, if
yeah,
you look
no.
at the world the way it is like you have Africa. How much like social conditioning and prodding and this and that do you need in like the Congo to make it to where they can be like libertarians who are just like, oh, let's like voluntarily trade with one another rather than let me like murder you and eat you because I'm hungry. You know, like shit like that. You know, it takes centuries long. And so what I kind of think of like talking in terms of covenant communities, this and that is like it's way it's way before that's a viable option. So, I mean, when you're living in a world where there are aggressive states, where there are aggressive people, you know, you kind of can't really rely on that. That's like a major luxury, and the only reason like America was able to like do that is because they only had like the reason like classical liberal America existed was because they really restricted immigration to like Northern Europeans, to like the Germans and the English and those people who had gone through hundreds of years of this sort of social conditioning.
Yeah,
And
no, I don't.
so,
I'm under no delusion that what I'm proposing is going to come about within my lifetime or even the lifetime of my fingers crossed progeny in the next, 5 centuries. I understand what I'm
got to get
talking
laid
about
first to have progeny.
Oof. But no, yeah, I mean, I'm under no delusion that what I'm proposing is hyper idealistic. And that's why I agree what you're proposing is something I'd like. At the same time, I also think there are steps, though, that we could probably do to speed up the process. There was this other guy, his name was Mouthy Buddha, I heard, and he proposed something along the line where if, I heard a discussion by Jordan Peterson where he said essentially people with IQs of lower than 85 can't really do any jobs, and so their only resort is going to be
Yeah.
parasitism and drugs and stuff like that. And it was like an excerpt from one of his lectures that he posted to his channel. But one of the things that Mouthy Buddha suggested for those kind of people was something along the lines of subsidized sterilization. Whereas if your life is just going absolutely nowhere, then the government will pay you to sterilize yourself, and so you don't have any of you're not continuing that horrible legacy, and you're kind of staying out of everyone's hair too. And there's a part of that where like something to that degree could be maintained for a while until eventually so many people have chosen to sterilize themselves to the point that they don't even their existence becomes fewer and fewer. And so there are things like I think there are things we could do to probably speed it up, but they have many ethical questions and hangups involved in them.
Yeah, that's one of the medical ethics. Was one of the things I was thinking about is just like you offer $1,000 to any woman to just have her tubes tied, and the type of people that take you up on that offer are going to be just like hood trash and just like pieces of shit that you don't want reproducing. So I mean, but I mean that is sort of like as far as medical ethics, I was reading something about that. It was just like paying people to get sterilized is unethical because you're taking advantage of need or hardship or some fucking liberal bullshit. And
And I mean, I
so
think
there are a lot of ethical things, but I do support that. And so I mean, but I mean, that's another thing is like that is a positive externality. Everyone in society benefits from less Shaniquas running around, and so it's inefficient to just fund that voluntarily. And so what you have is with positive externalities the same way. In theory, that's how schools are, but I mean that's debatable how good public schools are. But I mean, so in terms of positive externalities, you kind of coercively fund them to achieve these type of results. And I mean, before you do that, you gotta. But I mean, like that is a very useful thing to do. And I mean, like it would be inefficiently funded without the use of coercion because
yeah,
anyone who's receiving benefits, because so with public positive externalities, the hang up there is that receipt of benefits and payment, they're disjointed. So you don't need to pay to receive benefits from them. Versus like if you want to buy a pizza, you will not get that pizza unless you pay. So the benefits and the payment are linked. But with positive externalities, those are not linked. So I mean, it's just more efficient to have it funded by coercion.
yeah,
And
for the time
yeah.
being. Hopefully, by the time we reach my type of society where everything is voluntary, hopefully that funding has become unnecessary, and everybody who was
But if
low.
you qualify with the time being, and that time being is centuries, then it's like we kind of don't really have the time preference to discuss in terms of covenant communities and HOPA and voluntarism and all this and that
Yeah,
because
no, I mean, well, we're
that's not in our time preference.
yeah,
So
no,
that's so when
this,
I would like I would really enjoy like a covenant community, a world where we can live peacefully like that. I would prefer that, but I realize that that can never occur even within the next 100, 200 years. Probably, I don't know. I can't put a number on it, but it's just beyond my time horizon. So like that's why I've just kind of moved away from Hava, because I'm like, look, this is like useless. It's kind of like me trying to figure out how I would cultivate the moon, or how I would like grow crops on Mars. Like I'm never going to go there. My kids aren't even going to go there, probably. Or like I don't know how the time scale for that. So I view Hoppa. How do you say? Is it Hoppian or like Hoppa is
just like Hop A?
No, I know it's like Hoppa, but like is it like Hoppa and is it like Hoppian or like Hoppa?
Oh yeah, like the adjective is Hoppian. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I've been pronouncing it. But yeah. So I mean, so it's like similarly. I enjoy Hoppa's work, and I like he's on the right. He's like on the right path. He's like on the right. His conclusions are correct. Like in that's probably like one of the best societies, and I mean I would really enjoy that, but because I know that that's not how the world works. That's not how the world is, and that's really not feasible. That's why I've moved away from it. I haven't moved away from Hoppa because I think he's incorrect, but I've moved away from him because it's just not something that I can do right now. The same way that I don't think about how I can grow tomatoes on Mars. I don't think about how I could have a private covenant community, and that's why I've moved towards more of an authoritarian, statist type worldview, where I'm like, okay, if we're going to have the world, if we're going to have a state, we're going to use it correctly, and in a couple 100 years, and when humans are domesticated enough for us to form these voluntary communities, I mean, you would also have a natural progression of just like less and less authoritarianism, like the less people need to be prodded, kind of, and so in general, not always, but you'll have a tendency towards less authoritarianism, the less people need to be prodded and whatnot. So, and so that's kind of why I moved away. It's like, I'm not like I disagree with Hoppa, but and so similarly with the norms, that's we finally get back to that norms and culture. The reason I talk about defending culture and this and that, using force, using social prodding, using fines, using this and that, is because we live in a we are surrounded by people with low levels of conscientiousness, with low levels of empathy and self-awareness, and they're not aware of the world around them. And so because I'm surrounded by people like them, I'm going to say like, look, I don't give a fuck about voluntary interaction. You're going to get in line, or you're going to like be fucking cold. You know what I'm saying?
No,
and so
yeah.
that's where I'm coming from. It's like I don't want to enforce norms using property, but I do realize that they are important, and that I'm not going to just let the savages whittle them away.
Yeah, no, I think Hoppa is exactly there on you. Like pragmatically speaking, I think Hoppa is essentially a propertarian at the moment. I think even he knows that what he's proposing is like years off, and I think that's why so many people have a problem with what he says, like especially Jeffrey Tucker, because people know what he's calling for is the authoritarian use of enforcing social norms like you're advocating for, with the end goal of anarcho-capitalism one way or another. And I mean, pragmatically speaking, it sounds like I'm a propertarian too. I just want, I have a further end goal at some point, and that I'm not sure you might have. So I feel like we essentially have the same thoughts on this. Like, that's why people kind of shit on Hoppe and say he isn't even a libertarian sometimes because of what he proposes.
He's a much more of a libertarian than fucking Jeffrey Tucker. He annoys the shit out of me. But I mean, Hoppe is like, he's a lot more of a libertarian than fucking Jeffrey Tucker, who wants to like hand over his country to like Northern Africa.
Yeah, the Libertarian Party and the Libertarian movement has been fucking co-opted by leftists, but we realize that at this point.
Yeah, dude, the Libertarian Party is fucking joke. Like, if you're gonna vote, like I'm on the Cantwell's page. He's like, you're gonna get out there, you're gonna vote Republican, or else you're just gonna be fucking. You might as well be voting for Democrats. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? It's like even Gary Johnson. I had a lot of problems with him,
Yeah,
and I wasn't gonna just vote for him because he's just like he's an idiot.
yeah, like I mean, I like Austin Peterson. I still have my problems with him because he's one of those open borders type guys. But I mean, I'm supporting him in his Senate race for like what is it, Mississippi or Alabama or whatever.
Hmm.
Like because
Yeah, it's
he's
Missouri.
yeah, Missouri. Okay, he's a lot better than pretty much any other Republican options. But he's at
Hmm.
the same time he's still not perfect.
Yeah, he's problematic a lot. I don't know. Well, but I mean, basically, and so I mean, like the thing about propertarianism is it's not necessarily it's not an ideology the way anarcho-capitalism is, but it's more of a it's a method of analysis based on property in toto, which I don't like that term. But and it's just like instead of the non-aggression principle as it's found as its like fundamental principle, it's the principle about the core principle of propertarianism is natural law of reciprocity. And so when he says natural law, it's akin to the law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, and like laws that are discovered. So when we look at human interaction, we can kind of deduce that what makes them want to cooperate, the natural law of cooperation, is the foundational. I don't want to say axiom, but like the key is reciprocity towards property in toto, which is all demonstrated, which is all that they invest and seek retaliation against its infringement. So
Yeah, so I
people so
I
yeah,
feel,
the founding thing is reciprocity rather than private property that like Hoppe has. So, I mean, it's more of like uh,
it's
it's a philosophy, like a method of analysis rather than a ideology that has we're going to have this type of government and this and that.
No, I see what you're saying, and I feel like we're looking at the evolution of man, and we're looking at reciprocity and we're looking at the nature of man, and we're getting similar conclusions, but they're kind of disparate, I guess, and you'd say in their epistemology, I guess would be the correct term, because you're looking at it and seeing
Yeah,
reciprocity, and I'm looking at it and I'm seeing voluntarism, for just lack of a better term. But
yeah,
I guess let's just leave it off at that, I suppose, because we're gonna disagree on that little bit for a while, and I think
yeah,
we've been going for long enough. I'm surprised you
yeah.
didn't tap out at some point.
I've been like I've been putting this thing off, but I mean, what's it called? Yeah, but I mean, if you look at the history of man, it's like man is like you look at like a square, not aggressive white guy. That is a process of like a millennia of just like aggressive eugenic domestication. And so when you see people like the North Sea people, the British people, like Europeans, they through centuries they've had to think ahead, they've had to cooperate, they've had to have high trust in between them, and through various social pressures, like the church, they banned inbreeding. So what you developed was like uh, large in groups, large high trust in groups that are made through outbreeding. So you have you have very high trust societies, and so I mean, it's like it's not like some you can't really look at man as like oh he just popped up in 2017 and he's this guy. It's like that's a
Right.
product of like centuries and millennia of refinement. And so that's kind of how I look at man. It's like if you want a voluntary society, you need to, as voluntary as possible, you need reciprocity over all forms of property in toto.
Yeah, well,
And I
I
hate that
guess
word, but yeah.
reciprocity is kind of that just respect for property in the first place. So yeah, I mean, again, we're kind of looking at the same process, and where you're just viewing it as propertarianism kind of as the final realization, so to speak. I guess I'm kind of thinking there can be more to it than that, and it could be even more efficient in terms of cultural cohesion and economic opportunity and things like that. I guess it's just
You'll
how
come over
far we're willing
eventually.
to take it.
You'll come over eventually. Like I'll give it like 6 months, and you'll be like, "Damn, Hoppa's gay."
No, I'm set on it. I'm set on giving leftists helicopter rides. So I don't know. I don't know how quickly I'll be
Oh yeah,
swayed.
you got to domesticate the political ideology of man. Like you got to like, and you do that by fucking killing off all the leftists.
Exactly. You know what? I think that's a good note to end it on. Helicopter rides
Okay.
for leftists, folks. So uh, thanks for people who are watching, and adios, I guess.
All right. See you, man.
See ya.